chefs who are featured in the book, Food Gurus. We've had a few of them on the menu. That's their recipes. We've had Delia Smith as our appetizer, and then Fernand Point for the main, and then the second main with Elizabeth David's escalope of chicken. So we're going to continue on with this theme when we go into dessert. But first, I'd like to introduce Steve Vines, who is the author of the book on Food Gurus, which, with a small plug, you can buy tonight at the end of the meal. It's been interesting to talk to Steve because he's written on so many different topics, politics and economy, etc. But I think he really wrote this book from the heart in terms of his enjoyment about food and also in terms of exploring a topic that basically interested him. So he's going to come and have a chat with us to tell us about writing the book, and hopefully he'll tell us which one is his favorite food guru. Steve?
Well, Tara, thank you very much indeed. And also, I can't see him, but I want to thank Chef George, who did make a very special effort for tonight. Yeah. I know there was another event today somewhere, and who knows how that ended. But we've saved the best for last. So here we are. Tara's indicated that in a kind of polite way, I'd have to say that I might not really be qualified to write this book, which is typical hyperbole, and I was wondering whether that was so. I mean, you know, I've been a journalist most of my life. What do I know about arrogant people who are also slightly talented? What do I know of immodest people who can also be a bit charming? What do I know of surly and uncommunicative people who work like demons? What do I know of driven people who are terminally insecure? I know about chefs. And as Michael Caine famously said once he got into the restaurant business, you know, they call actors temperamental. Have they met chefs? Well, I employ chefs, and I can tell you Michael Caine is entirely right. And I've also worked with journalists for most of my life, so I know what stroppy people are like. I got into the food business thanks to the very wonderful but now deceased Tiny Rowland, who had the good sense to make me redundant from the Observer and therefore give me some money. The first time in my life, actually, that I'd had a sum of money, and I realized two things about it. One is that I would either spend it immediately or I could possibly invest it in a business. And the only thing that I thought that I knew something vaguely about was food. Of course, once you get into the food business, you then realize you actually know nothing about it whatsoever, but ignorance was bliss. So with Tiny's money, I got into the food business in a very small way, and that business has kind of expanded since then and takes up a lot of my working day. But I have to say that the reason I wrote the book was a process of self-education. I was trying to learn more about not just chefs, because, you know, chefs obviously have changed the way that we eat, but about other people who've influenced this enormous evolution of interest in food. And I thought that what I better do is focus, and the book does entirely focus on people from Europe and the United States, mainly because everything else outside of those two areas is beyond my pay grade. But I kind of feel that I know about Europe and the United States a bit. So then, of course, and this is the problem that faces anyone who has the temerity to write a book about any kind of gurus, you have to make a selection. You have to come to a conclusion. So I did early on think, well, I'll try and do 20 people. And how on earth do you select 20 people? So in the end, I thought what I would do is I'd do what I do best, and I'd work on prejudice. Not bother with objective criteria, because that gets really, really complicated. So you'll notice certain people aren't in the book because I'm extremely prejudiced against them. You will not be troubled if you read this book, excellent as it is, by Heston Blumenthal. Won't be troubled by him. You won't be troubled by Wolfgang Puck because I think he's an idiot. You won't see in this book any American chefs who jump about on TV. But you will see, because there are some people who just have to be in a book about food gurus, you will see the great gods of French cuisine. You'll see Escoffier, you'll see Carême, you'll see Bocuse, and you'll see Poin, and we've even eaten some of their food. And then I thought, goodness me, that's 4 French people and more. I've got to redress the balance. Being nice to the French is, there's no future in that sort of thing. So just to annoy French people, I thought I'd put in Catherine de' Medici. Now, I know she died in 1589, so she's not actively annoying anybody French, but French people get very annoyed by the idea that she brought food civilization from the court of Florence to France. But there is a good case to be made that she did. There's also a very strong, and if you read French books on the subject, you'll see a very strong body of literature which denies that she did any such thing. But the fact of the matter was that when she arrived as the child bride at the age of 14 to marry Henry, who took an instant dislike to her and focused entirely on his mistress, except for she did produce children and they managed to get a large number of whom managed to actually ascend to the throne. She did come from this extraordinary tradition of, how can I put it, sophisticated food. In Florence, they had culinary institutes there. They had all sorts of foods that had never been seen in France at the time she arrived. And she arrived, as you do, as I'm sure all of you do, with a sort of train of chefs in tail to make food for you. And, they brought all sorts of exotic things along, like artichokes, beans, broccoli, never been seen in France. They were apparently very good on desserts. And if you're not good, you won't get a dessert this evening. That was the idea of the break. Oh, good, thank you. So she's there mainly to annoy the French, but also because I think that it's a good way of talking about the evolution of food in Renaissance Europe. But I also have to say this isn't a fan book. There are people in this book who I frankly don't like at all, but I do see them having made an enormous contribution to the way we eat and the way we think about food. Robert Atkins comes to mind, the great dieting guru of, I would say, dubious fame, but he was certainly a person who's influenced a great many people. He didn't influence somebody else in the book, James Beard, who said that a gourmet who thinks of calories is like a tart who looks at her watch. I have no idea what he's talking about, but apparently that's an insult. And while we're on the matter of insults, of course, Gordon Ramsay is also in the book. And as you know, he sort of conducts masterclasses about how to yell in restaurants. But in between all of that, has an enormous influence on the way that people think about food. Some of the people in the book I really am an enormous fan of. Elizabeth David is one of them. And I'll talk a bit about her later. I got very keen while I was writing the book on Julia Child, who I thought was a rather peculiar woman at first. But the more I read about her and understood her dedication and the way that the generous way that she helped so many people, I realized that she was a very, very formidable figure who needed to be in a book about food, particularly her influence, obviously, in the United States. And then, again, because I thought it might possibly annoy people, particularly people who are described as foodies, I thought I'd put Delia Smith in, because she really annoys people who think they know about food. But she doesn't annoy me. I think that she's a very brilliant, she has some odd ideas about God, but other than that, I think she's a very brilliant and inspired person who has done more to teach people in Britain how to cook than I think practically anybody else on earth. There's this great story, and it happens to be true, about how on a television program she taught people how to boil an egg, and everybody said, well, you know, this is ridiculous. Everybody on earth knows how to boil an egg. The fact of the matter is that after that program went out, egg sales in Britain rose by 10%. So maybe everybody didn't know how to boil an egg, and all these things shouldn't be taken for granted. There's a common theme that runs through this book, and it applies to Delia Smith as it applies to everybody, and that is that this is a book essentially about fanatics, really hard-working people, extraordinary people. You take Escoffier, one of the most famous chefs in the world, who started work at the age of 13 in his uncle's restaurant. He was busy scrubbing floors, cleaning out pots, and then this 13-year-old boy in France decided that the only way for him to get ahead was to take him off to night school. He must have been dog-tired by the time he left the kitchen and went into a night school. Or you take Henry Hines, he of the big baked beans, who started work at 6, growing vegetables with his mother. By the grand old age of 8, he was selling vegetables to his neighbours. And by the extraordinarily grand old age of 10, he had his own 3.5-acre plot, plus a horse and cart, which he was supplying local restaurants with. So that's just the child prodigies. Take Fernand Point, a man after my own heart, weighed 370 pounds, rose at 4:30 in the morning, and modestly only had a magnum of champagne each day, while the barber came along to please him, and his famous catchword was, "I'm hard to please, I'm content with the best." And let's come back again to Elizabeth David, apparently a very, very difficult woman to get on with. She's died relatively recently. But I mean, here's a woman who had a minor stroke in the 1950s when she was 49. She had a cerebral hemorrhage. None of this slowed her down. She carried on working like a demon right up to her very last days. And the only other person I want to mention, because she's another formidable and magnificent person, is Marguerite Patton, another British person who is now 97. She's produced a modest 165 cookbooks, plus literally hundreds of recipe cards. She's still going strong. She's still writing stuff. She completely refuses to be defeated by age. And if I'm doing as well as she is at 77, let alone 97, I'll be very pleased with myself. So that's the fanatics. But I was now trying to think, what it is that brought us to a situation where food actually became entertainment. It's not all about eating anymore. You think that now, food was all about sustenance. Now food is entertainment and television. It appears in books. I'll plug a very good book again at the end. And it's become this kind of phenomenon. I mean, some of the, now, incidentally, that in book bestseller lists, they take out recipe books and food books, because otherwise the top selling book in every single list would be a food book. So it's kind of unfair to people who write these minor books like Harry Potter and what have you. So food now is this primary source of entertainment. How did we get to that situation? Well, some of it is to do with this fantastic explosion of choice, and that's to do with the radical changes in transportation, the fact that you can move a grain of corn from Africa to Europe at the flick of a finger almost. It's to do with storage techniques, which incidentally, of course, is why I have somebody like Henry Hines in the book, because he didn't invent canning, but think of the revolution that canning brought to the way that people could eat vegetables in all seasons, could eat other dubious substances also in all seasons. The fact of the matter was, it's this revolution in the storage of food that's produced the choice. And then, of course, it gets more sophisticated with freezing techniques, instant freezing techniques, and God knows what. So you have this massive availability of food, and then you have the fact that people have better incomes, they have more leisure, and they become interested in it as a subject, not just as a means of sustenance. So you learn something from writing a book like this. You learn that there is no such thing as nouvelle cuisine. Every generation keeps discovering a new cuisine, and what they've actually discovered is is some sort of development of an existing cuisine. Every generation with bright lights says, oh my God, we've just discovered fusion cuisine. We're going to mix Japanese food with, Irish food. That's an exaggeration. But, fusion cuisine. Let me tell you, all of this is entirely in the DNA of development of food. Every generation has had nouvelle cuisine. Every generation has had fusion food. And the more you look into the history of the development of food, you realize this is so. I also have to say that what's very interesting to me is that although I did set out just to write about chefs, because it seemed to me that was the obvious way to go, the more I thought about it, actually a lot of the people who've had the deepest influence on the way we eat haven't been chefs, like Isabella Beeton, very well-known figure from Victorian Britain, who died when she was 28, although her husband, who was her publisher, didn't tell the rest of the world because her books were selling so well. He thought it would probably be better if her name was kept on, even though the body was under the earth. But she actually probably couldn't cook. She had a maid, or a housekeeper, I suppose, who did the cooking. She probably didn't even write the recipes, but she had the genius of putting it all down, producing this enormously influential, big-selling cookbook and book of household management. Or you take Elizabeth David. Elizabeth David, who I said I'd come back to because she really is one of my great heroes. She was the woman who I think single-handedly lifted Britain out of the depression of the post-war food. I mean, this is a Britain where olive oil was only used for medicinal purposes, literally, where the idea of fresh vegetables was considered something a bit dubious, because we just don't do that, and any vegetable that was fresh had to be boiled out of existence. Into the 1950s, which was the period in which she first started to write about food, she produced these books with the taste and the smell of the Mediterranean. And people read these books and they said, my God, why can't we have some of that here? Actually, she probably wasn't a particularly outstanding chef. And the fact that some of her recipes don't work suggests that she might not have been good as a food technician, but she sure as hell was good at interesting people in food. I'm also thinking of other people who are in the book, like Jamie Oliver. Now, you must know, anybody who's been around restaurants, that in the world of chefs, there's enormous snobbery. And Jamie Oliver, I have to tell you, was only a sous chef when he went on television. So you go around the sort of chefy areas, and the first thing they'll tell you about him is, oh, that sous chef. Well, it's that sous chef who, with his kind of almost manic enthusiasm, gave so many people the confidence and the opportunity to experiment with food. And he has had this enormous zealot of a campaigner to improve food in British schools and subsequently in American schools. I went to a British school. I can tell you food did need to be improved. And I say that with no fear of contradiction. He, of course, is a cook as well as a campaigner, but the other person I have in the book who is purely a campaigner is Carlo Petrini, who is the founder of the slow food movement. Essentially, he had a rather dismal occupation before he was a journalist, but he, no one's perfect, but he has, again, single-handedly said to people, whoa, wait a minute, we're going too fast here. Let's slow everything down on the subject of food. Let's go back to some of the older ways of producing food. Let's eat more locally, all these things which are now quite popular ideas. But you have to credit Petrini and the slow food movement for making it such a mainstream issue. Away from the people who make food and talk about it, I've got two people in the book. As I say, Henry Hines, who didn't invent canning but knew how to develop that process. And another person in the book who I think is probably, you are more familiar, or the world is more familiar with his products than anybody else in the book. And that, of course, is Ray Kroc, the man who didn't even found McDonald's, but developed McDonald's. And what he used to say is, I didn't invent the hamburger, but I took it more seriously than anyone else. And boy, did he do that. I mean, the fast food industry was most certainly not created by McDonald's. At the time he got involved with the two McDonald brothers, who eventually he bought out from their smaller business in California, there were a number of fast food chains, much further than McDonald's. Much bigger than McDonald's. But the genius of Kroc was to systemize and standardize the production of food so that anyone in the world, from Mumbai to, now have to think of lots of M's, which I can't do, but you know what I mean, from around the world, could go into a place, get a product that was pretty damn similar to the same product as they could get in California, where McDonald's originated. It might not be the finest food in the world. Personally, I can't stand it. But the fact of the matter is, if you want a very cheap meal of consistent quality, regardless of whether you like that quality or not, McDonald's most certainly is the place to go. And more people, I would venture, have eaten a McDonald's meal than practically any other meal on earth. And that was down to Ray Kroc, the annoying man who would go into various outlets, and if he'd see a guy leaning on a broom, would say, if you've got time to lean, you've got time to sweep, and would get them all running around the restaurant. It's been a very rewarding experience writing this book, I have to say. I've had to consume some of the product myself. It's been one of those tough calls that you're called upon to do when you make the self-sacrifice of writing a book about food. But I do think that at the end of the day, as Tara said, I've written about politics, I've written about economics. That's very worthy, and it's almost certainly good stuff. But it ain't half as enjoyable as writing about food. So it's been great for me to write the book. And I would just urge you, I'm going to shamelessly use, because I've just seen this Beatles show the other night here, the words of the great God, John Lennon, or John Lennon as he appeared in the FT this weekend, who was talking about his record, saying, buy the record if you like it, and buy the record if you don't like it as well. And I say the same about the book, so I hope you'll do that. Thank you.
I hadn't thought this through properly because I had quite a few glasses of wine while I was enjoying dinner, but do we have some questions for Stephen about writing the book or about particular chefs before we move on to dessert? Just raise your hand. I think there's a microphone around the room.
He's a broadcaster.
Or you can just stand up and speak and shout.
There must be many people you consider that left out.
Oh, you want? No, I just wonder who you left out. You might have liked to have squeezed in, but obviously there are many food gurus that you know of that you can't do them all.
Yeah, I mean, 20 isn't really a very big number. I think I started out. In fact, I did. I started out with a list of about 100, and in the end, as I say, I worked on prejudice. I just wrote about people who I thought would be most interesting to write about. So I don't kind of regret anybody I left out. But I think there are big gaps in the book. I mean, for example, the only person from Italy in the book, besides Catherine de' Medici, is Pertini. Whereas I'm an enormous enthusiast of Italian food, and I think I should have put more Italian people in the book. But I had an enormous search for who would be more representative for the development of Italian food. And I think one of the wonderful things about Italy is good food in Italy is universal. I think you can say that more or less without fear of qualification. And it hasn't evolved in the way it has in France around strong personalities. It's evolved around organic tradition. and it was hard to find people. But you know, if I come to write another edition of the book, I'd make a more serious attempt at finding more Italians to put in there, I think. And I would like to, but this is more demanding from my point of view, to venture a bit more into Asia.
Over here.
What's your favorite recipe in the book, and what's your favorite story in the book?
Actually, I'm not that keen on the recipes in the book. They're in there for a purpose, to show in some way what the chefs do. I think, generally speaking, I'm like a lot of people who cook. I kind of regard recipes as a framework. I don't really follow them. So I think recipes give you ideas, but it seems to me most unlikely that everybody would like a dish cooked in a single way. So I personally don't really follow recipes very carefully, but I do use them a lot for ideas. Sorry, what was the other part? Oh, favourite story. Well, I do like that the thing which I mentioned when I was talking, James Beard's comments about dieting recipes. I'm a dedicated anti-dieter. You can see the results. I kind of like I like a lot of things to do with James Beard, because he was a kind of blunt-speaking, flamboyant, outrageous person who seemed to collect friends around. You know, there's now this big James Beard Institute in New York, which has trained and nurtured a lot of chefs, from some of whom come from quite humble backgrounds. So I kind of like things attached to him. He had a lot of very witty things to say, and telling things to say.
Aaron Negum, Stephen. I just wonder if you could say a little bit about your own food business here in Hong Kong, and any stories relating to it.
Well, I won't tell you anything about the chefs, because it's, you know, this is a sort of pleasant occasion. Yeah, my own business, the company that I run mainly does catering in universities. And it's been a revelation to me because, believe it or not, I went to a university as well and seem to remember that food in universities was pretty indifferent. On one of the campuses that we operate, which is University of Science and Technology, there are 14 catering outlets. Everything from Turkish halal food, Chinese food, there's a pizza place there, there's a McDonald's there. There's fortunately not a Starbucks there, unlike other universities who I won't describe. And we run a couple of restaurants there. One is a Western style full service restaurant, one is a coffee shop. So mainly what my company does is big catering, you know, big high turnover food. But we also have one Chinese restaurant and a big sort of Chinese canteen, which is in Chinese University. And I have to tell you, it's a nightmare. It's just because, you know, Chinese food, and it's a well-known fact that Guilos can't run Chinese restaurants, but anyway, Chinese food, as you know, has to be, that there's a level of freshness that's required, which means that there's a level of waste, which is quite terrifying. And there's very little Chinese food that can be reasonably pre-prepared. Most of it has to be cooked on the spot. Whereas there's quite a lot of Western food, and instead we do quite a lot of Indian food as well. Indian food I love because it actually benefits from heating and reheating. That is not true of Chinese food. So, you know, basically we do European food. We have an Indian chef, so we do Indian food, and we have this Chinese outlet. And I didn't have grey hair when we started having the Chinese outlet. That's all I can tell you.
Steve, I really enjoyed your description of the personality, the strong personality of chefs and the food gurus. In your research, who surprised you most as you started to learn about their background and personality and how they succeeded?
Well, I think in a way it was Julia Child, because Julia Child, you know, people say, which isn't true actually, but anyway, people say, oh, she had this extraordinary war where she was working as a secret agent. She wasn't actually doing that, but she was working with the special services, and she ended up in what was then called Ceylon with her husband. But her husband went into the diplomatic service, and this rather extraordinary woman says, oh, I'm in Paris. This is where he was posted. What is France famous for? Oh, food. I'm going to learn everything there is to know about French food. And you may say, well, you know, so what? But when she was determined to do it, she did it in this extraordinary way. Her famous book about French cooking is, much to the embarrassment of many French people, has been translated into French, and is a Bible of French food. I mean, with two colleagues, they systematically went through the entire, if you like, Bible of French food and put it into a form that everybody could understand and read. And throughout the rest of her career, ending up, when she was really quite old, she has this extraordinary track record of helping people, friends, people who were in trouble. She even, towards the end of her career, helped a friend start up a restaurant, which wasn't really her thing at all, but she lent her name to the restaurant. It didn't succeed because it was kind of a project which was done more out of love than out of common sense. So the more I read about her, I really warmed to her. I didn't really know much about her before I started doing the research, but I came out thinking, you know, this is a pretty worthy person.
Over here.
Well, Steve, you published this book. You're an authority on fine food. Julia Child and Martin Yan and Graham Kerr. Remember Graham Kerr, the galloping gourmet?
Yeah.
I think before everyone's time, I remember very well. I think your next step, obviously, is to host a globally syndicated cooking show. We'd all like to listen to it.
Yeah, I know my limitations.
Is there anyone in the book who's influenced love of Indian food, Chinese food in Europe, for instance?
No, not in my book, because I didn't do that. I think, you know, that's one of the problems. I didn't do Asian food. I have to say that the problem with that is, particularly for Chinese food, is most of the source material is in Chinese, which I don't read. But I just find it an education going into Chinese restaurants. I mean, the superb food you can eat in Hong Kong in a Chinese restaurant, to me, is an education in itself. And what is really annoying, which is one reason why I think there aren't many good books about Chinese food, in my experience, is how fantastically uncommunicative Chinese chefs are. And I don't think that's a language barrier. I think it's a cultural barrier. They just, you know, they say, well, I cook the food. What do you want to know? and you know, you could say, well, that's fair enough. The food speaks for itself. But if you want to write about it, it's not terribly helpful. I just don't know enough Indian chefs to know whether they're quite so uncommunicative. I rather doubt it. The Indian chefs that we've employed in my company have been extremely communicative, possibly excessively so. But you know, there is now I mean, I know in America you've got, as Joel was talking about, people like Martin Yan, but I mean, people like that kind of make a caricature out of Chinese food rather than taking it seriously. And it's a pity because, you know, of course, you can in fact eat fabulous Chinese food in America. I don't think you can see fabulous Chinese food on American television though, which is a pity.
Just thinking of that before we move on to dessert, is from my very scant knowledge of cuisine, is that you have Asian chefs who are very competent at cooking Western food, but I don't know any Western chefs who've actually achieved cult status at cooking Asian food. Is that because it's so much more difficult to do?
Well, that's a fantastic point. I mean, the only person I can think of, just off the top of my head, who's broken that barrier is David Thompson in Thailand, who's an Australian who's become extremely well known as a master of Thai food, has written interesting books about Thai food, runs Thai restaurants with his partner. He is, I think, the exception that proves that rule. It's true, most of the traffic has gone entirely the other way. I mean, I can't think, for example, of a single Western person who's made an impact on Japanese food. But the other way around, there's a lot of Japanese chefs who produce extremely fine Western food. I wonder what the answer is to that. I don't know.
Is it complexity of cuisine or training?
I think it comes down to access to information. What you could read more or less everything you need to read to at least find out all the techniques of producing Western food and about the ingredients and how it's sourced and how it develops. That's all there. There isn't that much in that detail on the record about various Asian foods. Maybe that's the problem. You know, that one of the chefs that I like on television, and I'm now going to embarrass myself by not remembering his name, the guy who does the seafood, the British guy, Rick Stein, yeah. There was a program that he did going around Asia. Maybe some of you had seen this. And, you know, the kind of conceit of the program is that he ends up cooking the dishes. And I noticed that he didn't actually end up cooking the dishes. There was always sort of somebody there doing it. And I don't know, was that because nobody could explain to him? I mean, he is clearly a talented and you know, multi-talented cook, but, you know, I kind of feel if he can't do it, what chance does the average Joe have of managing that?
Very interesting. Any last questions before we move on to dessert? One back here.
Yeah, I've got a double Delia Smith question. First of all, how long did Delia recommend that you do boil an egg? And secondly, did it bother you with Delia Smith that whenever she cooked, she always used to wipe her hands on the same tea towel?
I have to admit, Delia Smith is the only person in the book who I have actually much more direct information with about anyone else, because her producer happens to have been is a friend of mine. She's no longer her producer. But let's deal with the tea towel issue first, because that's clearly the big issue. The great thing about Delia Smith food, as seen on television, is it was so rigorously tested and tested and tested before it ever got there. So that most of the stuff that she cooked actually had, I mean, it was genuinely, she did cook it, but most of the stuff you saw on the TV hadn't really per se actually been produced by her. So it doesn't really matter which tea towel she used. And I think you'll find that on the big egg question, the genius that she imparted to the great British public wasn't so much the length of boiling time, but the fact, which may seem very obvious to all of us, but wasn't obvious at the time, was the fact that eggs taken out of the fridge are really not the best way to boil an egg. You have to have an egg at room temperature, and this was a point that she sensibly stressed and does make all the difference. Once you've got the egg back at room temperature, I mean, in Hong Kong we have to keep eggs in the fridge, but in Britain you really don't need to do that. But people do, because they've got those funny little compartments in the fridge which people feel compelled to use. But I think once you've got it back at room temperature, 4 minutes will do fine.
Anna.
Yes? No. Is there a cure for MasterChef?
not known to person kind. But I mean, you know, this is actually the kind of thing which I think gives food a bad name. You know, what is the point? I completely do not understand. What is the point of having to produce food within 10 minutes or 15 minutes? I understand if you're in a restaurant, you don't want to keep the punters waiting. But these aren't chefs in restaurants. These are people, and their genius is supposed to be that they can put together a dish in 10 minutes. Well, so what? I don't get it. I really don't get it. And all that flapping around and sniffing. There's a lot of sniffing goes on in that program, which I'm very suspicious of. So is there a cure? I think it's terminal would be the cure. I'd say.
Delia's main observation, I don't know if you saw this, was that an awful lot of people tried to boil the egg in the kettle.
I know. I know.
Should try that. We have one over here.
I think it's phenomenon of Junior MasterChef. Look at those kids; they're incredible. Has somebody prepared them for that, or given them lessons, or are they just good at what they do?
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is, you know, in the same way as you've got child prodigies who play the piano at 9 and dazzle all of us, you've got kids who are great at cooking at an early age. But to me, it's all part of the extension of food as the entertainment industry. I mean, given the enormous popularity of MasterChef, it didn't take that much of a genius to say, you know, if we put some cute little kids on this, we might have a show. I mean, I think the kids are great, but in the way that, you know, you've got child prodigies in everything you can think of. So why shouldn't you have it in food? That would be. I'm not prejudiced.
One comment back here.
Sorry, Stephen, just quickly.
Yeah.
What's your view, good or bad, on the influence of supermarkets today?
Yeah, that's a really big question. I mean, the simple fact of the matter is, if we live in Hong Kong, we have a terrible, supermarkets are so appalling here because of the duopoly and the effective lack of competition that it's hard to remember that in other places, supermarkets, in my view, actually can be a force for good. First of all, they did bring down the cost of food, which as a consumer, I'm all in favor of. But nowadays, you go into a supermarket, I mean, I'm most familiar with supermarkets in Europe, outside of Hong Kong. You see a wall of bread. You can buy 50 types of bread in a supermarket. I think that's pretty damn fantastic. You can buy fruits from all over the world. Then you have the debate, well, should you be buying fruits from all over the world? Should you just be buying fruit that's grown on in the place that you live? But if you want to address the question of choice, I don't think there's any doubt at all that supermarkets have made this phenomenal contribution. And let's not forget, and again, I have to talk about Britain in this respect, the revolution that occurred in Britain when supermarkets opened beyond 5:30. You forget that food shops used to close when everybody was at work. So if you were a working stiff and you wanted to get in food to cook a meal, that's partly due to supermarkets, partly due to the extraordinary influence of various immigrants, particularly Indians from East Africa, who started opening these shops that opened at all hours. But all of this has contributed to the choice, convenience, and availability. So on balance, I know they do bad things, but on balance, I'm actually a big fan of supermarkets.
I suppose you bring it local again. You come back to the anomaly of Hong Kong. We are in a food haven, a food center, where you have some of the best chefs, all types of cuisines, and yet we have some of the worst supermarkets. Whereas if you go to New York or London, you have the best of both. Why do we have that in Hong Kong?
One word.
Duopoly, right?
Duopoly. Oh, that's 2 words. And of course it's to do with the way the property market operates here. It's no coincidence at all that both of those supermarket chains are offshoots of property companies. And when you got, as you did in Hong Kong, an attempt by a third company, which was Carrefour, which is an enormous company by any standards, when they tried to break into the duopoly, not only did the supermarket duopoly threaten all the suppliers with something very nasty to their middle parts, but they couldn't find space. Why was that? Because the people who own the supermarkets also controlled the property. It's a hermetically sealed circle of you can't have any space if you're not part of the duopoly, and we'll do terrible things to your suppliers if you dare to supply food to them. So I think, unfortunately, we're stuck with this appalling situation. Now, I notice now, at least they have the good grace to be embarrassed. So have you noticed how the Hong Kong supermarkets now keep giving themselves different names? So Park and Shop is now Park and Shop, or Fusion, I can't remember all the taste. I mean, it's all the same rubbish, but, you know, under a variety of new and unexciting names.
Well, maybe we should start a local movement. We'll take one more question.
So is the organic food trend, is it just a fashion statement, or is it really beneficial?
I think it's really problematic because a lot of what is said to be organic, frankly, isn't. Secondly, I think that the reality is, and although I have great admiration for the slow food people who I think were the first to really get onto this organic food thing, I think the simple reality is that you could not feed the food, you could not feed the world organically. If that is the reality, you will have to be shipping food around the world from places that can make mass production of various sorts of fruits and vegetables and grains, and people who can't. Having said all of that, that doesn't mean that if you have the possibility of eating organic food, I don't see why you shouldn't do it, but I'm not a fanaticist for it. I don't, you know, I live in Hong Kong, I like to have olive oil. I can't think of a Hong Kong olive oil supplier offhand. So I might buy a bottle of olive oil that's labeled organic, in fact I do, but I'm well aware that that's been sent over here in an aeroplane, big carbon footprint on its way in, etc., etc. So, you know, I think it's the way of the world that organic is not what it's cracked up to be. I'm a bit dubious about it.
I think we'll leave it on that note. Stephen Vines, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts, passion, writing. We do have a small gift from the club to thank you, and then we'll pass it on to dessert. Thanks again.
You've been so well behaved, you get dessert.